All right, this is part two, the Bible and Contradictions. In the first episode, we talked about the fact that there are translation errors and what a contradiction actually is. And on this one, we're going to discuss the context errors. So there's different types of context. The first one is going to be historical context, and that should be pretty simple to understand. Number one, we have like local idioms, local customs. Then there's timeline issues as far as the history of things go. And when it comes to local idioms of the time period, that's usually just a simple misunderstanding on our part. For instance, Revelation 10:10 says, "And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter." Now, this was used several times in the Old Testament as well, and that local idiom is actually something similar to what we use today. So, in historical context, it's very clear that he's talking about reading a book, and he is using something from that historical context and that language to describe what it did to him. It is not some fantastical, fake, made up story or a dream or something crazy, okay? He didn't literally eat a book, but the literal way to read this is to understand the context. So we think that, and I say we as in people who say that this is a contradiction with the Bible, is that this is obviously a fake story and you can't read the Bible literally and all this stuff. However, in this modern age, sometimes we'll use idioms similar to it, like, man, I just ate up her words the way she was praising me. Or when we go to the library and you get a good book, I devoured that book. It was great. Or when somebody tells you something terrible that happened, maybe you heard about a car wreck and you say, it made me sick to my stomach to hear about that. That's exactly what he says in Revelation. I ate it up, the book, so I read the words, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and as soon as I had eaten it, it made my belly bitter. It turned my stomach. I devoured the book. I ate up her words. You see how that works? If you understand that that was used in several places in the Bible. The other thing to think about is local customs. For instance, people see contradictions in everything, and I like to point to, and people sometimes like to point to historical fact as proof that the Bible said something wrong. For instance, slavery. Okay? The Bible doesn't teach that we should own slaves, but people still owned slaves, and it's documented in the Bible. That is not a contradiction. It's not saying slavery is okay. It's a historical custom that is well documented in the Bible that there were slaves in the Old Testament, even some in the New Testament as well. Now, another historical context is timeline issues. For instance, did something happen twice? Or is it even two different stories? Remember when I said about the 10, if the Bible said there were 10 commandments to Moses and then later it said there were 5 commandments, those both can't be true unless God gave Moses commandments 2 different times, and one time it was 10 and one time it was 5. Like you'd feel pretty stupid if you tried to say that was a contradiction and it's clearly 2 different stories, right? Or what about if it's told from 2 different perspectives? What about one person seeing him with one stone tablet and only 5 commandments on it, and he records that? And then 3 days later, the other guy sees him with two tablets, 5 on each, and it's 10 commandments. So it's 2 different people, 2 different perspectives, 2 different historical contexts. Both are true based on those perspectives. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened. The Bible doesn't say that that was just a made up example, okay? But here's one that is in the Bible. Sometimes there's a retelling of the same story. John does this in Revelation. Many of the stories in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is told from those 4 different authors' perspectives. The book of Genesis goes into detail and tells a story twice. So John in Revelation, he does this, I think, 3 different times. I did a study on this a while back if you wanted to check it out. But he states what he's going to tell you. Then 3 chapters later, he explains in detail what he was talking about, and you get more information, and it looks like it's a second thing that happened. And then 5 chapters later, he explains everything in chronological order, and talks about it and he adds some more detail for you, but it's the same thing. He's talking about something that will happen in the future, and he tells you what he's going to tell you, then he tells you what it is, and then he tells you what he told you. That's actually something that you learn in college for doing an outline for a story. That's what you're supposed to do, right? So this historical context can change based off of the timeline issues, the local customs, the language, the idioms of the time and the language group. And then you also have grammatical context. Don't forget that. You have parts of speech, metaphors, similes, fact versus thoughts versus dialogue of people talking. You also have different points of view, the first person, personal experience. I did this in the Bible. Then you have the third person. I saw this happen. Then you have hearsay, where people say that they saw things happen and the writer heard the people say it. He's not affirming that what they said is true. He's just saying that's what people talk about. And we see this supposed contradiction with the death of Judas Iscariot. So, real quick, an example. The man hit a home run and ran all the way home, if you read that in a sports column, right? The grammatical context is you're writing about sports, using a metaphor, in the historical context of baseball that uses an English idiom. It does not mean that the man ran home to his mama in another city and did a marathon. And see, we'll read other things. We'll read newspapers, we'll read books, we'll read magazines, and we'll understand the idioms. We'll understand the historical context. We'll understand the metaphors. We'll understand it's the sports section, not the comics section or the history section of the newspaper, right? But when it comes to the Bible, all of that just goes away. No, that's not how reading and writing works. So you also have to understand the literary context. We need to keep the literal sense of the text in mind. In other words, we seek to interpret the text in the sense in which it was written and the way it was intended to be read. Whether we're reading a narrative, poetry, history, prophecy, or a letter, we try to get in the shoes of the original hearers and read a text the way it was originally meant to be read. So you have types of writing, like I just discussed. You have to take into account who the author was and what his intent might have been. Like Moses freeing the people and teaching them about God for the first time. The book of Psalms, which was just singing truthful things. The Gospels was written by a doctor, a tax collector, a religious man, and then the youngest apostle of the 12, John. 4 different viewpoints of the same events. Sometimes appear to be contradicting accounts, but they're not. And then you have to take into account the audience, especially for the local places and sayings, words known only in that time period and such, what language they were speaking, what their culture was like understanding that when he gave the metaphor of the Roman soldiers in Ephesians chapter 6, the people that were hearing it were used to seeing Roman soldiers every day, so it made sense. And then, of course, we have to understand the biblical context. Sola scriptura, it's Latin for by scripture alone. And that means that Scripture is self-authenticating. It is clear to the rational reader. Scripture interprets Scripture, and it's sufficient by itself for to be the final authority of Christian doctrine. We do not get to make up our own interpretations. That is contrary to the holy book, the Bible. So let me give you some specific examples, all right? We're going to talk about slavery. The Old Testament, Leviticus 25:44 appears to approve of slavery. Talks about the bondman and the bondmaid, which you will have, the heathen that are around you, that you can buy them and such. But then it condemns them in Exodus 21, and it says, he that stealeth a man and selleth him, slavery, he should be surely be put to death. Then in the New Testament, it does the same thing. It says it appears to approve slavery. In 1 Peter 2:18, it says, servants, be subject to your masters. Ephesians 6:5, servants, be obedient to them. And then it turns around and condemns it in 1 Timothy 1:9 and 10. Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for whoremongers. You get the idea, these are all evil people, right? For them that defile themselves with mankind, for men stealers, which the actual word is andropodistes, which is an enslaver. Okay, liars, perjured persons, if there be any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine. So it condemns enslavers of people. So first of all, those verses that appear to approve of slavery in the Old and New Testament speak of bondmen, bondmaids, bond slaves, and servants. Every one of those is someone that is paid. Now, still a lower class, still a menial position, but they were still paid something. Now, the bond ones were specifically like indentured servants. You owe something, so you have to work it off for so many years, okay? Second, slavery was a worldwide issue. So God was teaching his people, the Jews, that all men were equal in God's eyes and should be treated fairly. So that's in 1 Peter 2, Galatians 3:28, etc. And third, all servants in the Bible are taught to eventually be freed. Exodus 21 requires that your bond slave must be freed after 6 years of labor. That's not slavery the way we think of it today. Okay? 1 Peter 2:17 says, honor all men. The Bible talks about all men being paid, whether it be a wage, room and board, working towards their debt being paid off, whatever. And then the year of Jubilee, they must be freed. That's in Leviticus 25. Ephesians 6, if you read the whole context, talks about how all men should be treated with dignity and honor. So this is quite the opposite of a contradiction about slavery, isn't it? It's more about changing the world to abolish slavery, and that the people who have servants, not slaves, must treat them better than the world did. So slavery is actually not a contradiction in the Bible. Here's another one, the creation story. Birds, this is kind of funny. Birds made from the water versus birds made from the ground. In Genesis 1:20, it appears to say that the birds came out of the water, and in Genesis 2:19, it says that God created them out of the dust of the ground. So this, quote, contradiction is a disingenuous and false reading. Clearly, the ocean life and the air life were two separate creations, and it's simply a timeline issue. Chapter 1 is the summary of what happened, and chapter 2 provides more detail. Same thing with the man and woman made at the same time after the animals in Genesis 1 versus the contradiction, supposedly, that man and woman were made separately before the animals in Genesis 2. There is no first, second, or then statements within the 6 days of creation. Every word is from God. To try and insert words and to create a timeline within the individual days is contrary to Scripture. It's adding to the Bible. For instance, saying that I made steak and potatoes for dinner and then telling someone else that I made potatoes and steak is not a contradiction. I did not say that I made potatoes and then I made the steak, and neither does the Bible when it comes to the creation days. So again, chapter 1 is a summary, chapter 2 is providing more detail. Here's another one. People commonly say the death of Judas Iscariot is a contradiction. In Matthew 27, it talks about how he hanged himself. In Acts 1, it talks about how he tripped and burst asunder and all his bowels gushed out. Okay, it says he fell headlong. So first of all, he might have done both. The Japanese ritual of seppuku, I think it's called, is the samurai warrior class where they would gut themselves with the blade, right? He might have hung himself and gutted himself at the same time. He might have hung himself, the rope broke, and his body fell headlong into something pointed that ripped open his body. Either way, it doesn't matter. The grammar of the two texts indicates one fact in Matthew, he hung himself, and one hearsay based on what people talked about in Acts. Paul said it was known to all the dwellers at Jerusalem. Paul didn't see it. He was telling us what people said about the death of Judas. None of it matters because hearsay versus what somebody knows is fact is two completely different things. Not a contradiction. All right? Now, I wanted to point out one more thing about that too, because it's kind of important in regards to Paul versus Matthew telling the story about Judas Iscariot. So we will cover that and a couple more contradictions on part 3.